My name is Maya Vance, and I am 29 years old. Last Christmas, my father looked me dead in the eye at a crowded dinner table and called me an absolute fool for choosing to spend my weekends sitting in a dusty attic with my grandmother instead of networking with his high society business partners. He told the entire family I was throwing my life away on a woman who was slowly losing her mind. That night, my sister Lily laughed. My brother Austin agreed. They were both too busy counting the millions they assumed they would inherit from our family's real estate empire to notice the small, heavy cream envelope my grandmother had slipped into my hands on the front porch before the snow started falling. When I broke the red wax seal on that envelope at midnight in my tiny rented apartment, the floor beneath me felt like it completely tilted. Inside was not a generic holiday greeting, and it wasn't a fragile family heirloom. It was a certified copy of an independent commercial trust, completely separate from my father's corporate control. For 20 years, while my parents called me the slow, unaccomplished child and focused every ounce of their wealth on my siblings, my grandmother had been quietly building an architecture of protection specifically for me. A portfolio of 12 historic downtown properties, completely debt-free, valued at exactly $47 million. The next morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, a private bank manager locked the heavy glass doors of a downtown vault behind us, sat me down at a polished mahogany table, and said 4 words that would ensure my family's carefully constructed empire would crumble in less than a week. He looked at the paperwork, looked at my face, and whispered, "She chose you, Maya." Before we get into how a single sealed envelope exposed 20 years of systematic emotional abuse and flipped a corporate dynasty upside down, please take a brief moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story of quiet resilience and absolute structural justice truly resonates with your own soul. Drop your city and your local time in the comments section below. I read every single one of them, and I want to know exactly where you are standing right now, while the truth finally catches up with the people who thought they could erase you. Now, let me take you back to the damp, gray autumn of 2006, to a cold kitchen table in Darien, Connecticut, and the very first time I realized that love in the Vance household was purely an exercise in ledger book accounting. Growing up, our house was a 3-story colonial with pristine white siding and a perfectly manicured lawn that my father, Arthur Vance, treated like a corporate asset. Arthur was the managing partner of Vance Development Group, an old-money commercial real estate firm that his mother, Sylvia Vance, had handed down to him with the strict instruction to build something that mattered. But Arthur didn't care about building communities. He cared about building a performance. My mother, Eleanor, was a woman who managed our household with the clinical precision of an auditor. She valued 2 things above all else: social status and perfect compliance. My siblings delivered both with absolute, effortless perfection. Lily was 2 years older than me, a natural-born performer who excelled in classical violin and high school debate. She was the daughter my mother took to charity galas, dressing her in matching silk gowns so the local papers could photograph them together. Austin was my younger brother, the golden heir who possessed my father's sharp jawline and arrogant boardroom stride before he even turned 14. I was the middle child, the quiet one, the daughter born with a severe auditory processing delay that made traditional classrooms a nightmare. When I was 10, the words teachers spoke in class didn't settle into my brain as sentences. They arrived as fragmented puzzles that took me twice as long to piece together as everyone else. My parents didn't see a child who needed patience. They saw an embarrassing defect in their flawless family portrait. I remember a specific Tuesday evening after a parent-teacher conference. I was 12 years old. I was sitting on the bottom step of our grand staircase, my knees pulled tightly to my chest, listening to my parents' voice carry through the heavy wooden doors of my father's study. "We have to face reality, Arthur," my mother said, her voice dropping into that chilly, detached register she used for bad investments. "Lily is already on track for the Ivy League. Austin has a natural instinct for the business. But Maya, we've spent thousands on cognitive specialists, and she still struggles to summarize a basic reading assignment. At some point, we have to stop pouring resources into a dry well. She simply doesn't have the Vance DNA." My father didn't defend me. He didn't suggest a new tutor, and he didn't tell her that his middle daughter had spent 3 weeks straight building a flawless three-dimensional balsa wood model of a Gothic cathedral in her bedroom. He just sighed, a heavy, dismissive sound that settled into my bones like winter frost. "You're right, Alina," he murmured. "We'll secure a basic administrative track for her at the firm when she's older, something out of sight. We need to focus our capital where it will actually yield a return." That was the night I learned there is a profound difference between being forgotten and being deliberately hidden away. I didn't cry. Instead, I learned to adapt in the absolute silence of my own mind. While my siblings spent their weekends at expensive preparatory clubs and high-end networking events, I began taking the 40-minute train ride every Saturday morning to my grandmother Sylvia's house in the historic district of New Haven. Sylvia's house was a massive, weathered Victorian surrounded by ancient copper beech trees that blocked the harsh midday sun. It smelled of aged cedarwood, old ledger paper, and the bitter, comforting scent of loose-leaf black tea that she brewed in a tarnished silver pot. Sylvia was 78 years old back then, a woman built like a steel cable wrapped in an unpretentious wool sweater. She had run Vance Development Group with absolute integrity for 30 years after my grandfather passed away. Before handing the operations over to my father in a move she would eventually grow to regret deeply. The very first Saturday I arrived on her porch, shivering from the autumn wind with my binder of remedial schoolwork clutched to my chest, she didn't pity me. She didn't look at me like I was a broken project that needed fixing. She simply opened the heavy oak door, looked down at my face with her sharp, knowing blue eyes, and patted my shoulder with a firm, dry hand. "Come inside, Maya," she said, her voice carrying decades of unshakable authority. "Your father thinks the world is built entirely by people who talk fast in boardrooms. He's wrong. The world is built by the people who know how to sit still and look at the structure of things. Let's get to work." For the next 10 years, my grandmother's kitchen table became my real education. While the specialists my parents hired tried to force me into traditional reading patterns, Sylvia used a completely different blueprint. She would spread out the original, hand-inked blueprint designs of the properties she had acquired in the 1960s across the butcher block table. She taught me to read contracts not by memorizing long blocks of legal jargon, but by visualizing the flow of money, responsibilities, and liabilities as physical weight. "A bad contract, Maya, is like a poorly designed load-bearing wall," she would tell me, pointing her thin, ink-stained finger at a clause in an old lease. "Your father reads these lines looking for a quick shortcut he can exploit today, but if you look closely at how the columns are aligned, you can see exactly where the structure will crack 20 years from now. Never look at the paint, sweetheart. Always look at the foundation." I discovered that my auditory delay wasn't a disability at all when it came to spatial and financial architecture. Because I couldn't process verbal noise quickly, my brain had developed a hyper-advanced visual memory. I could look at a 50-page corporate spreadsheet or a complex property title chain and immediately spot the asymmetric patterns, the hidden anomalies, and the structural discrepancies that high-priced corporate attorneys completely overlooked. My parents had no idea this education was happening. Every Saturday evening when I returned to Darien, my mother would look at my quiet disposition and say, "It's so sweet of you to keep your grandmother company, Maya. It's good for you to have a simple routine since school is so taxing for you." I would just smile, set my coat on the hook, and keep the steel in my spine hidden. They thought I was keeping an old woman company out of pity. They had no idea I was being trained by the master builder who had laid the bricks for everything they owned. The real fracture in our family dynamic began in the spring of 2018, the year I turned 21. Lily had just graduated from Yale with honors, and my father threw a spectacular celebration at the Darien Country Club. There were 300 guests, crystal ice sculptures, and a chamber orchestra playing classical music near a stage draped in banners bearing Lily's achievements. During the main toast, my father stood at the center of the room, his champagne flute raised, his face flushed with the kind of arrogant pride that comes from absolute social validation. "Lily represents the absolute peak of the Vance family future," Arthur announced into the microphone, his voice echoing off the gilded ceilings. "She possesses the intellect, the the drive, and the legacy to take Vance Development Group into the next century. That is why tonight, Alina and I are officially establishing her future equity share in the corporate holding company. She has earned her place at the head of the table. The room erupted into applause. My sister smiled with practiced political modesty. From my seat at the far edge of the room, table 18, situated directly behind a massive decorative pillar near the kitchen service entrance, I watched the performance with absolute clarity. I glanced down at the printed program my mother had designed. On the back page, under a section titled Asterisk Family History, there was a prominent paragraph celebrating Lily's legal achievements, followed by a note about Austin's early admission to business school. At the very bottom, there was a single, clinical sentence. Maya Vance also resides in the family home and provides administrative support. Under the white linen tablecloth, a hand suddenly found mine. Thin, papery skin, but a grip that was surprisingly solid. I turned my head. My grandmother Sylvia was sitting right beside me at table 18. My mother had placed her there, away from the main stage, claiming that the loudspeakers near table 1 would be too overwhelming for an 89-year-old woman. Sylvia didn't look at the stage. She was looking directly at me, her eyes holding a fierce, quiet intensity that looked almost like an impending storm. "Look at them, Maya," she whispered, her voice cutting through the noise of the applause like a clean blade. "They are celebrating a house built entirely of paper cards. Your father thinks that because he has the power to assign the seats at this party, he has the power to decide who holds the land. He has forgotten that I bought the dirt beneath his feet before he knew how to sign his own name." She reached into her wool cardigan and pressed a small, heavy brass key into my palm. "Keep this safe in your drawer," she murmured. "Don't ask me what it opens. Just keep it wound, keep your eyes open, and never let them see you flinch. Your father is about to show us exactly who he is, and when he does, you will be the only one standing on solid ground." 3 months later, my grandmother's health took a sharp, sudden downturn. She didn't go to a hospital. She refused to spend her remaining days under fluorescent lights, surrounded by modern machines. She stayed in her Victorian house in New Haven, her world shrinking down to her bedroom that looked out over the copper beech trees. My father immediately moved to capitalize on her weakness. On a brutal Thursday afternoon in November, he called an emergency meeting at the Vance Development headquarters. I was 22 then, working in the windowless copy room on the 3rd floor, earning a meager $40,000 a year, while my sister Lily occupied a corner office with a starting salary of $280,000 as junior corporate counsel. My manager had sent me up to the executive floor to deliver a box of fresh legal printing. As I approached my father's double oak boardroom doors, I realized they weren't fully latched. The heavy brass handles were loose, leaving a 4-inch gap of empty space. I stopped. The hallway was completely deserted. Through the opening, my father's voice carried with absolute boardroom authority. "We need her to sign the Global Corporate Restructuring Amendment before the end of the quarter, Lily," Arthur was saying, the sound of legal paper rustling against the polished table. "As long as your grandmother holds the 1995 independent trust shares, she technically retains a veto power over our expansion into the luxury residential market. If her mind is starting to slip from the illness, we can argue diminished capacity to expedite the transfer of her remaining assets into our primary holding company." "I've already drafted the documents, Dad," Lily's voice came back, smooth, articulate, and entirely devoid of human empathy. "We can take them to the New Haven house on Saturday. If Maya is there doing her usual caretaking routine, we can just tell her it's a standard pension renewal form. Maya won't read it. She struggles to process a basic lease agreement anyway. She'll just help us get Grandma's signature so she can go back to making tea." I stood in that carpeted hallway, the heavy cardboard box of paper in my hands suddenly feeling weightless. The letters of their corporate title on the wall didn't swim or rearrange themselves this time. They settled into a single, freezing reality. My father and my sister weren't just choosing to overlook me. They were actively calculating how to use my perceived slowness as a weapon to strip the founding matriarch of her life's work. They thought my auditory delay made me deaf to their execution. They had no idea that while they were preparing their cards, I was already visualizing the entire foundation of their architecture cracking wide open. If you have ever stood in a silent room or a hidden hallway and realized that the people who were supposed to protect your family were actually calculating how to exploit your quietness, please type the word asterisk enough in the comments section below right now. Let me know that you understand exactly what it means to hold your breath and wait for the right moment to strike. Let's keep driving forward, because what happened next on Christmas Eve of last year is the exact moment the Vance family dynasty ran entirely out of road. Fast forward to December of last year. I am 29 years old. I had left the Vance corporate offices 2 years prior, refusing to spend another day photostating documents for executives who looked through me like glass. I had taken a position as a budget analyst for the city's public housing authority, a low-profile, highly technical job that paid $55,000 a year, but allowed me to spend my days analyzing complex structural data and property titles without anyone checking my pedigree. I lived in a modest, 500-square-foot studio apartment in East Haven, shared with a golden retriever named Blueprint, who never once judged me for processing things in silence. My grandmother Sylvia was 99 years old, her once commanding frame grown impossibly thin, her silver hair a soft halo against the white pillows of her bed. The pancreatic cancer had reached its final, unyielding stage. For 6 months, I had spent every single Friday and Saturday night sitting in the vinyl chair beside her bed, holding her cold hand, reading her historic property records out loud, and helping her manage the pain medication while my family attended corporate retreats in Aspen and holiday mixers in Manhattan. On Christmas Eve, my father insisted on maintaining the absolute illusion of Vance family perfection. He mandated that the entire family gather at our old colonial house in Darien for our annual catered dinner. The dining room was spectacular. A crystal chandelier cast thousands of prismatic lights across a long mahogany table set with sterling silver and gold-trimmed charger plates. 20 relatives were gathered, drinking expensive wine and performing the roles of wealthy, successful elite. My father stood at the head of the table, his wine glass raised, his tailored suit immaculate. "It has been a monumental year for Vance Development Group," Arthur announced, his eyes sweeping across the faces of his corporate partners and extended family. "Lily has successfully secured our new land acquisitions in Fairfield County, and Austin has officially closed our largest commercial lease to date. We are building a legacy that will endure for generations." He paused. His gaze drifted down the length of the table, past the cousins, past the aunts, until it landed squarely on me at the very end. The warmth in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by that familiar, clinical irritation. "And of course, we have Maya," my father said, his voice dropping into a patronizing register that caused several of our cousins to let out soft, uncomfortable chuckles. "Maya continues to do her quiet work for the city. And while she prefers to spend her weekends sitting in a dark bedroom with her grandmother instead of participating in our corporate expansion, we are glad she could find the time to join us at a proper table tonight." My sister Lily leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light. "We just hope Grandma hasn't completely lost her mind up there, Maya," she said with a sharp, performative smile. "Dad tried to call the house yesterday, and her private nurse said she wasn't accepting corporate calls. At her age, with that level of cognitive decline, she really shouldn't be left alone with someone who doesn't understand legal structures." I sat perfectly still. I didn't lower my eyes, and I didn't let a single tear fall into my untouched plate of roasted lamb. I looked directly across the long table at my father, then at my sister, and felt the final load-bearing wall of my relationship with them completely dissolve. "Grandma hasn't lost her mind, Lily," I said, my voice incredibly calm, level, and clear. "She knows exactly who is holding the title, and she knows exactly who is trying to change the locks. You don't need to worry about her cognitive capacity. You need to worry about your own." The entire dining room went dead silent. The clinking of silver against crystal stopped instantly. My mother set her wine glass down with a sharp click. "Maya," Alina warned, her voice ice cold. "That is entirely enough. You will not disrupt your sister's evening with your typical resentment. If you cannot behave like a Vance, you are welcome to leave this table." "I am leaving," I said quietly. I stood up from my chair, my spine perfectly straight. I didn't look back at their silent, shocked faces as I walked out of the dining room, down the grand hallway, and out onto the front porch into the freezing December air. As I reached the bottom step of the porch, the heavy oak front door opened behind me. I turned, expecting my father or brother coming to deliver a final corporate decree. Instead, it was my grandmother's private nurse, a steady, unbothered woman named Carla who had cared for Sylvia for 3 years. She was wearing her winter coat, and her face was pale but completely resolved. She didn't say a word. She simply walked down the steps, took my trembling hands in hers, and placed a large, heavy cream envelope sealed with thick red wax directly into my palms. "Sylvia passed away quietly 40 minutes ago, Maya," Carla whispered, her eyes wet but fierce. "She waited until your father's dinner started. She told me to give you this the exact second Arthur threw you out of his house. She said to tell you, the blueprints are complete, Maya. Go open the vault." I stood on that snow-slicked gravel driveway for 3 full minutes, the freezing Connecticut wind whipping through my thin wool coat, staring down at the heavy cream envelope clutched in my hands. The red wax seal gleamed under the yellow porch light like a drop of fresh blood. Inside the house behind me, the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking crystal glasses drifted through the frosted windows. My family was inside celebrating a holiday built on an empire of paper cards, completely unaware that 40 miles away in a quiet room in New Haven, the matriarch who built the very foundation beneath their feet had just taken her last breath, and she had left her final strike entirely in my hands. I didn't walk back inside to tell my father his mother was dead. I didn't cry. I simply tucked the envelope inside the breast pocket of my coat, got into my old rusted sedan, and started the engine. By midnight, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my East Haven studio apartment. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of Blueprint's tail against the linoleum as he watched me from the foot of my bed. I broke the red wax seal with a kitchen knife. Inside were 3 distinct items: a heavy, notarized legal document bearing the official seal of the New York and Connecticut state courts, a small handwritten letter on Sylvia's personal parchment stationery, and a sleek, modern security access drive. I reached for the letter first. My grandmother's elegant, slanting blue ink handwriting filled the page, steady and unyielding as a blueprint line. "My dearest Maya, if you are reading these words, then Arthur has done exactly what I calculated he would do. He has chosen the flash of the spotlight over the security of the dirt, and he has formally erased you from his table. Do not weep for him, sweetheart. He has spent 20 years building his own prison, and tonight he has finally finished the walls." The enclosed document is the certified deed and operational charter of the Vance Maritime and Commercial Trust. In 2006, the exact year your father and mother decided your auditory processing delay made you unfit for their corporate legacy, I stepped down as active chair of Vance Development Group. But I did not dissolve my original assets. I quietly transferred 12 of our family's historic downtown commercial properties, the absolute crown jewels of our original portfolio, out of the holding company and into this independent trust. For 20 years, I have channeled every ounce of the rental yields, commercial leases, and structural equity from those properties back into this private fund. Your father believes he owns the Vance corporate headquarters tower. He believes he controls the downtown retail grid. He does not. The trust holds the primary ground leases on every single one of those parcels. Arthur has been paying rent to me for 2 decades without ever reading the fine print of his own corporate charter. And tonight, Maya, you are the sole successor beneficiary and co-trustee of everything. Walk into First National Bank tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Mr. Harrison is waiting for you. Take what is yours and let the architecture fall. My hands shook as I unfolded the legal ledger pages beneath the letter. My eyes tracked across the column figures with absolute visual clarity. Because my brain processed information as spatial structures rather than verbal noise, the numbers didn't swim or rearrange themselves. They fell into perfect alignment, 12 commercial parcels, completely debt-free, a compounding cash equity account sitting at exactly $14 million with a total property valuation of $47 million. My father's primary development firm, Vance Development Group, was currently leveraged to the absolute hilt. They had borrowed nearly $30 million against their future projects to fund a massive, high-end residential expansion in Fairfield County, a project engineered entirely by my sister Lily. But the land they were building on was subject to a 20-year ground lease held by the Vance Maritime and Commercial Trust, a lease that expired in exactly 5 days. If the trust did not sign the renewal amendment by December 30th, the ground lease would default. And by law, every single structure built on that dirt, including my father's pristine corporate headquarters and Lily's $30 million development project, would legally revert to the ownership of the trust. To me. I closed the folder. I didn't feel a surge of malicious joy, and I didn't feel a desire for petty revenge. I felt a cold, crystalline sense of absolute structural balance. My father had spent 20 years assigning me to the back of the room, believing my quietness was weakness. He had forgotten that a building doesn't care about the volume of the voice inside it. It only cares about who holds the deed to the dirt. At exactly 7:45 the next morning, the snow was still falling in thick, heavy sheets across the gray pavement of downtown New Haven. I parked my rusted sedan outside the imposing granite facade of First National Bank. I was wearing my standard work blazer, a gray, unpretentious piece from a department store, and carrying a leather portfolio I'd used since my college budget courses. At 8 o'clock sharp, a tall, silver-haired man in a tailored charcoal suit unlocked the heavy glass front doors from the inside. This was Mr. Harrison, the private wealth manager who had handled my grandmother's independent accounts since 1985. He didn't look at my scuffed shoes, and he didn't check my pedigree. He looked at the cream envelope in my hand, looked at my face, and offered a deep, solemn bow of respect. "Good morning, Miss Vance," Harrison whispered, his voice carrying the quiet gravity of a courtroom clerk. "Your grandmother instructed me 3 years ago that this day would come. Please follow me." He led me down a carpeted corridor, past the standard teller windows, and down into the reinforced concrete vault in the basement. He unlocked a private boardroom with a heavy brass key, pulled out a polished mahogany chair for me, and set a massive ledger folder on the table. He turned the key in the cabinet, locked the heavy glass doors of the vault area behind us to ensure absolute privacy, and looked across the table at me with an expression of profound validation. "For 20 years, Arthur Vance has attempted to audit your grandmother's private filings," Harrison said, sliding a pen toward me. "He sent his corporate lawyers, he sent Lily, he sent private investigators to find out where Sylvia was channeling the secondary commercial yields. He never found them because your grandmother established this trust under a maritime charter from 1965 that predates his corporate structure entirely. Legally, Arthur Vance has no standing. The moment you sign this successor acceptance form, you assume 100% operational control over the ground leases of his entire corporate grid." I picked up the pen. My hand was completely steady. "Let's sign, Mr. Harrison," I said. "My father has an emergency board meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock this morning to finalize his new financing. I think it's time we deliver the new blueprints." If you are watching this right now, and you know exactly what it feels like to sit in a quiet room while the absolute proof of your worth is laid out on paper, a proof that the people who hurt you can never erase or deny, please type the word *** karma * in the comments section below. Let's keep moving, because the storm inside that corporate boardroom was about to make the blizzard outside look like a gentle spring rain. At 9:45, I badged through the service entrance of Vance Tower, the 20-story glass and steel skyscraper that served as the headquarters for Vance Development Group. The lobby was a cathedral of white Italian marble and polished chrome, designed entirely to intimidate anyone who didn't possess an old money last name. I didn't take the service elevator this time. I walked straight to the executive lift, my leather portfolio clutched under my arm, and pressed the button for the 20th floor. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive suite, the atmosphere was thick with corporate panic. The glass walls of the main boardroom revealed 12 senior board members, 3 primary institutional investors, and my family sitting at the center of the walnut table. My father, Arthur, was standing at the head of the table, his tie loosened, packing back and forth with a look of intense irritation. My sister Lily was frantically scrolling through a laptop screen, her diamond rings clicking sharply against the keyboard. My brother Austin was arguing with a representative from the regional bank over a stack of financing drafts. The secretary at the front desk, a woman named Sharon who had looked through me for 5 years, stood up instantly when she saw me cross the carpet. "Maya, what are you doing up here?" she stammered, checking her digital monitor. "This is a restricted session for the executive board and primary lenders. Your father explicitly stated you were not on the authorized attendee list for today's restructuring." "I'm not here for my father's listing, Sharon," I said, my voice completely level and calm. I pushed through the heavy double-oak doors of the boardroom before she could touch the intercom. The heavy brass handles clicked open. The entire room went dead silent. 12 board members turned their heads in a single, synchronized motion. My father stopped packing, his face instantly flushing with that familiar, patronizing anger. "Maya," Arthur barked, slamming his palm flat against the walnut table. "What is the meaning of this? This is an emergency financing session worth $35 million. We are in the middle of closing our Fairfield restructuring, and your grandmother's private nurse just notified us that Sylvia passed away last night. We don't have time for your emotional outbursts or your sibling jealousy today. Go back down to your desk or leave the building immediately." My sister Lily stood up, buttoning her designer blazer with an elegant, dismissive smirk. "Dad, let me handle this," she said, looking down the length of the table at me with false sympathy. "Maya, I know you're upset about Grandma passing, but this is a multi-million-dollar corporate transaction. You don't have the legal or financial training to be in this room. Your cognitive delay makes it impossible for you to understand what we're restructuring here. Sharon, please call security and have my sister escorted to the lobby." I didn't flinch, and I didn't step back toward the elevator. I walked straight to the foot of the long walnut table, pulled 3 identical certified copies of the Vance Maritime and Commercial Trust Charter from my portfolio, and slid them across the polished wood directly into the hands of the primary institutional investors. "I understand the restructuring perfectly, Lily," I said, my voice cutting through the corporate tension like iron. "You are attempting to borrow $35 million against the Fairfield commercial parcels. The problem is, you don't own the dirt beneath those parcels. Your primary ground lease expires at midnight tonight, and as the sole successor trustee and majority owner of the Vance Maritime and Commercial Trust, I am officially denying your application for a renewal." My father froze. The color instantly began to drain from his face, turning his skin the shade of old paper. "What absolute nonsense are you talking about?" he muttered, looking toward Lily. "Lily, what is she saying? The trust is an internal pension fund. I hold the managing signature." "You held a temporary operational signature, Dad," I said, leaning forward and placing my grandmother's letter directly on top of his financial drafts. "A signature that was conditional on your maintenance of the family framework and Sylvia's original bylaws. In 2006, the day you and Mom decided I was a bad investment, Grandma stripped your holding company of the primary ground titles. For 20 years, you've been paying rent to a trust you didn't bother to audit because you were too busy looking at your own name on the side of the building." The lead institutional investor, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Vance from the commercial lending block, pulled his reading glasses down his nose as he scanned the certified stamps on the document I had handed him. His eyebrows rose completely to his hairline. He looked up, his gaze shifting from my father to me with a sudden, freezing intensity. "Arthur," the investor said, his voice dropping into a deadly, clinical register. "Is this accurate? This document carries a certified, undiluted court seal from yesterday afternoon. This girl isn't an administrative assistant. She holds the primary veto power over the entire Fairfield land title. If this lease defaults at midnight, our $30 million collateral completely disappears." Lily rushed around the table, her perfect composure completely fracturing as she tore the paperwork out of the investor's hand. Her eyes darted across the lines, her mouth opening and closing like a fish running out of oxygen. "This can't be legal," she whispered, her voice cracking down the center. Grandma was sick. She was suffering from advanced cognitive decline. Maya manipulated her in that bedroom. "Dad, this is fraud. We can challenge her capacity in probate court. We can freeze her out." "You can't challenge anything, Lily," I said, stepping closer until I was looking directly into her wide, terrified eyes. "Grandma underwent a full, independent psychiatric evaluation by the head of neurology at Yale New Haven Hospital every single month for the last 3 years. The final certificate was signed yesterday morning at 10 o'clock, witnessed by 2 independent state notaries and her private counsel. She wasn't losing her mind. She was simply keeping the blueprints hidden until you finished building your own trap." My father sank slowly back into his executive leather chair, his hands trembling so violently that the papers he was holding slipped through his fingers and scattered across the Italian marble floor. The absolute machinery of his mind was trying to reassemble 20 years of arrogant certainty that was crumbling in real time under the cold, fluorescent lights of his own boardroom. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the very first time in 29 years. And for the first time in my life, I didn't see irritation or shame in my father's face. I saw pure, unadulterated terror. The silence in the boardroom of Vance Tower was so heavy you could hear the soft, rhythmic clicking of the server rack cooling fans inside the IT closet down the hall. My father, Arthur Vance, sat frozen in his high-back leather chair, staring at the scattered papers around his feet like a captain watching his ship's deck slide beneath the waves. My sister Lily remained standing. Her hands pressed flat onto the polished walnut table, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The 3 institutional investors didn't wait for my father to recover. They quietly gathered their leather portfolios, zipped their designer briefcases, and stood up from the table in a single, synchronized movement that carried the absolute finality of a courtroom sentence. Mr. Vance, the lead lender, looked down at his watch, then turned his freezing gaze directly onto my father. "Arthur," he said, his voice entirely emptied of corporate warmth, "we have an explicit fiduciary duty to our bank's board. We cannot, under any circumstance, authorize a $35 million debt restructuring against commercial assets where the primary land lease defaults in less than 12 hours. You lied to us about the stability of your titles. If your daughter files a formal eviction or a title holdover at midnight, Vance Development Group goes into immediate technical default on $40 million of existing senior debt." "Jim, please," my father stammered, his hand lifting in a weak, desperate gesture he had never used in his entire life. "It's a family matter. We can negotiate. Maya is a reasonable girl. We can draft an internal equity settlement before the end of the business day. Lily, show him the secondary corporate reserves." "There are no reserves, Dad," my brother Austin muttered from the corner of the room, his face the color of wet chalk as he stared at his phone screen. "The regional bank just pulled our short-term credit line based on the title flag Maya's wealth manager logged at 8:15 this morning. The algorithmic systems have already restricted our operational capital. We are locked out." Mr. Vance didn't stay to listen to the math. He walked toward the double oak doors, pausing for a fraction of a second beside me. He looked at my gray department store blazer, looked at the unyielding steel in my spine, and offered a short, professional nod of absolute respect. "Good luck, Miss Vance," he whispered. "Your grandmother was the finest structural mind this city ever saw. I'm glad to see she left her metrics in capable hands." The investors filed out of the room, the heavy boardroom doors clicking shut behind them with a definitive metallic latch sound that signaled the absolute end of the Vance family dynasty. When the room was down to just my family, my sister Lily finally broke. She ripped the diamond earrings from her lobes, threw them across the table, and screamed at me, her voice cracked wide open with pure, raw desperation. "You ungrateful, malicious freak," she shouted, her face twisting into something unrecognizable. "We gave you a roof. We gave you a job in the firm. We let you sit at our table. You sat in that dusty bedroom with a dying old woman and poisoned her mind against her own son just to steal an inheritance you don't even have the brain capacity to manage. Dad built this tower. I built the Fairfield expansion. You have done nothing but photocopy documents your entire worthless life." I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't step back from her rage. I stood at the foot of the walnut table, my hands resting lightly on the leather portfolio, looking at her with a level of clarity that only comes when you are completely free from the need for someone else's approval. "You didn't give me a roof, Lily," I said, my voice carrying the absolute weight of objective facts. "Grandma bought the house you sleep in. You didn't give me a job. You gave me a hiding place because my quietness embarrassed your social circle. And I didn't poison Sylvia's mind. I simply sat beside her and listened to her lay out the structural flaws of your character while you were busy spending money you hadn't earned. You read contracts like a thief, Lily. You look for what you can exploit. But you forgot to check if the ground beneath your feet was actually yours to claim." My mother, Alina, pushed through the boardroom doors at that exact moment. She had been at a holiday luncheon down the street, and someone from the executive floor must have called her cell phone. Her pristine designer coat was half-buttoned, her hair slightly displaced by the winter wind. She looked around the wrecked boardroom, saw my father slumped in his chair, saw Lily crying, and turned on me with a cold, maternal fury I had been surviving since I was 7 years old. "Maya Vance," my mother hissed, stepping closer until her heavy Chanel perfume filled the empty space between us. "You will end this absolute circus this instant. I don't care what legal papers your grandmother signed while she was losing her faculties. You are my daughter, and you will sign a global release of those ground leases right now. Think about the family name. Think about the scandal. What will the papers say when they find out Vance is foreclosing on her own father's office?" I looked at this woman who had spent 28 years adjusting my collars, comparing my grades, and telling her friends I was the slow one to save her own social pride. "The family name died last night in New Haven, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly soft but unshakable. "And I stopped being your daughter the night you told Dad I didn't possess the Vance DNA because I couldn't summarize a reading assignment at 12 years old. I don't care about your scandal. I care about the structure. And the structure says your lease expires at midnight." My father stood up from his chair. He didn't stomp his boots this time, and he didn't slam his hand flat against the walnut table. He looked like an old man whose suit was suddenly 3 sizes too big for his frame. He walked down the length of the table, his steps heavy and uneven, until he was standing 2 feet away from me. "What do you want, Maya?" Arthur asked, his voice cracked down the center, rough as concrete dust. "You want the company, you want my chair, you want me to step down. Name your terms, just don't default the Fairfield land lease. It will kill everything I've built in 30 years. "I don't want your chair, Dad," I said, looking into his hollow, terrified eyes. "And I don't want your company. I've spent the last 3 years working for the city's housing authority, learning how to build spaces that actually protect people instead of just performing for investors. I am not cutting you out of your firm, but I am setting the new architecture." Effective at midnight, Vance Development Group will restructure into a non-voting subsidiary. Lily will step down as corporate counsel immediately and surrender her equity shares to fund the employee pension deficit you've been hiding for 3 years. Austin will return to an operational internship where he will actually learn how to read a ledger from the ground up. And you, Dad. You will remain as a consultant with an administrative salary of exactly $42,000 a year. The exact salary you paid me to stand in your copy room while you called me an idiot. My father opened his mouth to deliver an old boardroom decree, a natural reflex of a man who had spent 3 decades telling people who they were. Then he looked at the certified state seals on the trust paperwork, looked at my unblinking face, and slowly bowed his head. A small, devastated nod of absolute defeat. "Fine," he whispered. I didn't wait to hear my mother's screams or my sister's tears. I closed my leather portfolio, turned around, and walked toward the executive elevator. As the steel doors closed on their shocked, ruined faces, I leaned against the back wall, took my very first deep breath in 29 years, and let the old family story completely dissolve behind me. 1 year later, it is a crisp, brilliant Tuesday afternoon in June of 2026. The sky over New Haven is a spectacular, cloudless blue that turns the glass facade of downtown into a clean grid of light. I am 31 years old now. I am sitting at the massive butcher block kitchen table inside my grandmother Sylvia's Victorian house, which I have spent the last 12 months converting into the central headquarters for the Sylvia Vance Foundation, a nonprofit commercial incubator that provides long-term land security and structural development grants for young women from difficult family situations who need someone to believe in their vision. The house doesn't smell of corporate panic or old money pretense. It smells of fresh pine wood, loose-leaf black tea, and the sweet, clean wind blowing through the open windows of the back bedroom that looks out over the copper beech trees. Vance Development Group still exists, but the gold letters have been stripped from the side of the tower. It is now called the Vance Structural Trust. My father, Arthur, leaves his modest apartment in East Haven every morning at 6:30, arrives at his desk by 7, and manages the basic leasing analytics for $42,000 a year. He doesn't pace, he doesn't shout, and he never once skips a page of the fine print. Aunt Ruth told me last week that he spent 3 hours leveling a single cabinet in his office because he said he could feel a quarter-degree tilt that would eventually crack the molding. He is finally learning how to look at the foundation. My sister Lily lives in a small rental apartment in Vermont, working as an assistant clerk for a family law practice. She doesn't post about her luxury mixers, and her diamond rings have been sold to pay off her student loans. We don't text, and we don't have holiday dinners, but she sent a short, handwritten note to the foundation last month. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a request for an equity share. It was a single sentence. I am reading the ground leases myself now, Maya. I take a slow sip of my black tea, looking down at the hand-inked 1960 blueprints spread across the butcher block. Under the table, Blueprint's tail thumps a steady, rhythmic pattern against the old oak floorboards. If you are standing somewhere in your life right now where the people who share your DNA are treating you like an invisible defect, trying to relegate you to the back table or the windowless copy room of their own design, I need you to hear my voice. Stop waiting for them to see your worth. Stop begging for a seat at a table that was built entirely of paper cards. Move out into the silence. Sit still, look at the structure of things, and find the people who hold the dirt. Because when the storms of life finally hit their performance, your family won't get a trophy for the volume of their shortcuts. They will look around the room in absolute terror, and they will find a door that you entirely control. You decide when it opens. You decide how wide it swings. And you decide exactly who gets to walk through. That is not revenge, my loves. That is architecture.